The nation's long web of interstates provided the perfect hunting ground for a depraved predator. He preyed on hitchhikers wandering the roads. He held them captive, then tortured and raped them. When that didn't satisfy his warped cravings, he killed instead.
Across the nation, a serial rapist targeted unsuspecting women. It was only a matter of time till his dark urges raged out of control and led him to murder. He followed a path so random, it was impossible to trace, and all that tied him to his crimes were his access to the highways and a bizarre sexual fetish. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When investigators believed the suspect had committed dozens of murders, the FBI was determined to put the brakes on his nationwide rampage.
February 5th, 1990. On a road in Houston, Texas, 18-year-old Nicole Tuttle desperately tried to flag down passing motorists. Someone finally stopped for the bruised and bleeding woman.
Oh my God. There's a guy trying to kill me. There's a guy trying to kill me.
The driver took her to the closest phone to call police.
Please help.
At the Houston police station, Nicole told officers that she had been kidnapped and assaulted, but she'd managed to escape.
I have to get out.
Her ordeal began in California 1 week earlier. On January 29th, she hitched a ride from a trucker at a rest stop. He said his name was Dusty and that he was headed east through Arizona. After a few hours on the road, she fell asleep in the back compartment of his truck. It seemed that was exactly what he was waiting for. He climbed in back and overpowered her. Before she was fully awake, he chained her to the walls and gagged her with a horse bit. The trucker whipped her and pierced her with pins and fishhooks. He also raped and sodomized her. Nicole told police that she was chained inside the cab for 6 days. Her ordeal didn't end there. Inside his Houston apartment, the trucker allowed her to bathe, then chained her to the bed and raped her again. She watched helplessly as he approached her with a straight razor. He pressed the blade close to her scalp and began to slice off her hair. After 3 hours, he forced her back into the truck. This time, he failed to bind her. When they stopped at a brewery, he left her alone as he walked inside to sign for his new freight.
Do you know how many days that you were in the truck?
Nicole knew this might be her only chance.
Where did you...
She ran for it, still wearing a dog leash around her neck.
I needed to go to California.
Houston police stopped a trucker in the area whose rig fit Nicole's description.
Hey, Nick.
She said he was not the man who attacked her. A background check revealed no outstanding warrants or convictions, so police released the trucker. Nicole told the officers to stop searching. She was too frightened to testify against her attacker. She just wanted to go home to California. On February 5th, the same day that Nicole escaped, another young woman was on the highway thumbing for rides. Just 15 miles away in Pasadena, Texas, 14-year-old Regina K. Walters was running away with her new boyfriend. Her parents were divorced, and Regina usually stayed with her father in Houston. She'd been visiting her mother for a few days when she fled and began hitchhiking. Whether she was following the lead of her new teenage boyfriend or just testing her independence, a trucker soon stopped for the pretty young girl. Regina's mother, Carolyn Walters, was a single mom who worked long hours as a department store clerk. When she came home from work, she was surprised to find her daughter was not home.
Regina?
Her daughter did not answer.
Regina?
Carolyn found no notes and saw no other signs that her daughter had been back to the house. She checked the answering machine, but Regina had left no messages. Carolyn called her daughter's friends and Regina's father in Houston.
Hello, Chris.
No one had heard from the girl.
Is Regina there?
The distraught mother reported her daughter as a missing person to Pasadena, Texas police.
I'm Detective Jackson. How are you?
She spoke with a detective from the juvenile section, providing the officer with Regina's description. Her 14-year-old daughter was about 5 feet tall, weighed 95 pounds, and had long, curly brown hair. The detective asked Carolyn what steps she had taken so far to find her.
Has anyone heard from her?
Carolyn had posted missing persons flyers, but no one had yet responded. The worried mother hadn't heard from her daughter since they argued 2 nights before. At 9:30 that night, Regina told her mother she was going to visit a friend.
I just think you ought to stay home tonight.
When Carolyn objected, the girl insisted she would be right back.
No, it's not. Well, I want... Regina, what?
Against her better judgment, Carolyn relented, trusting that Regina would call if she stayed out later.
But you can go ahead.
Though the young teen had a history of running away, she always returned on her own.
Anybody about her parents or where she is right?
Her mother believed this time was different.
Does she have a boyfriend?
Pasadena, Texas police detective Suzanne Jackson of the Juvenile Division was assigned the case. She understood Carolyn's concern.
Several days passed, and Regina would normally call her mom when she would leave home and let her mother know that she was okay and that she was just out. She would be back when she was ready to come home, and she had not done that.
You can just set those up later.
Carolyn posted more flyers at the convenience store close to her house. She held out hope that her daughter was unharmed. Maybe she was simply staying with a friend. Along with Regina's photo and description, Carolyn offered a reward for information on her daughter's whereabouts. "5 days after Regina's disappearance, Carolyn received a phone call.
You know someone who's been with my daughter?
The caller had seen Regina talking to 2 young men on the evening she left her mother's house.
Okay.
The person only knew the men as Billy and Ricky,
Bye-bye now.
but she remembered that Billy had a girlfriend with the peculiar name of Urena. Carolyn immediately called police.
Speak to Detective Jackson, please.
The following day, a second caller gave Carolyn the address of an apartment where he had seen Regina at a party 2 days before.
Here it is. Doesn't sound
When
like you
police
went home.
arrived, no one answered.
Okay.
The manager told them the apartment was rented to a man named Billy Wayne Gibbs. The next morning, the detective told her colleagues about the case. She mentioned she was looking for Gibbs in connection with Regina's disappearance. She was also looking for 2 others, a woman named Urena and a man named Ricky. She didn't know their last names. To her surprise, the officers did. Billy Wayne Gibbs had a girlfriend named Urena Sweet and a friend named Ricky Lee Jones. The 3 were wanted in connection with an auto theft. Units were dispatched to Gibbs' apartment to wait for his return. Officers patrolled the nearby road. After several hours of surveillance, they picked up 17-year-old Gibbs and his girlfriend Urena near his apartment. Police handcuffed the young couple and brought them to the station for questioning. The third suspect, Ricky Lee Jones, was still at large. The arresting officer asked Gibbs if he had seen Regina or Ricky Lee Jones. Gibbs said he had spoken to them 4 days ago, but not since. He told police that Ricky and Regina were in love and planned to run away to Mexico where Ricky had relatives. The detectives suspected that 18-year-old Jones had another reason for leaving town. If he were caught with Regina, he could be charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor.
Regina was 14, and they obviously were boyfriend and girlfriend at the time. When they saw the flyers that the mother had left out with reward on her location, they decided that it would be best to leave the area so they wouldn't be caught. And that's when they decided to leave the area, hitchhike to Mexico.
The detective learned that Ricky Lee Jones was already on probation for theft. Fleeing jurisdiction was a parole violation. She issued a warrant for his arrest. She also fed Regina's description into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a database listing both victims and criminals nationwide. If Regina were located by any police department in the country, Pasadena, Texas police would be notified. Until then, with no known address or vehicle, it would be difficult to find the pair. 15 miles away, Houston police interviewed Jerry Walters, Regina's divorced father. He told them he had received a disturbing call on his unlisted home number on the evening of March 17th. The conversation was brief, and Walters did not recognize the caller's voice. The man asked, "Are you Regina's father?" When Walters replied yes, the man told him he knew where to find Regina. He said she was in a loft of a barn, and that there had been some changes. He had cut the girl's hair. Regina's father asked if she was dead or alive. The caller hung up without answering. Detective Jackson asked Southwestern Bell to trace the call. The company told her it would take several days. Police would simply have to wait. Aside from the phone records, the trail of the missing 14-year-old and her boyfriend was stone cold. In March of 1990, Pasadena, Texas police detective Suzanne Jackson continued her search for 14-year-old Regina K. Walters. The girl hadn't been seen since early February when she left a friend's house with her 18-year-old boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones. The detective's only lead was an anonymous phone call made to Regina's father on March 17th. The call had yet to be traced. On the same night Regina's father received his call in Houston, her mother in Pasadena, Texas also got a call.
Hello?
She recorded the conversation as police had advised.
Yeah.
An unknown man told Carolyn to meet him at 6:30 the next morning at the local convenience store. He had something to tell her about Regina, and he wanted to say it in person. Without giving his name or description, he hung up. Carolyn called Detective Jackson, who told her it was risky to meet the man. When Carolyn insisted, Jackson said police would go with her for protection. From a distance, officers kept an eye on Carolyn as she waited at the convenience store for the unknown caller. She had no way of knowing if the man knew who she was, and no way to identify him. Her only hope was if he would approach her. She studied everyone who came in and out, and everyone who used the phone. Carolyn waited over 2 hours. The caller never came forward. 2 days later, Pasadena, Texas police received the phone records for both calls to Regina's parents. They learned that the call to Regina's father in Houston was made from a gas station in Ennis, Texas, 200 miles northwest of where she was last seen. The call to her mother's home in Pasadena, Texas, was made from a payphone only a few blocks away.
At that particular time, it was obvious that we were becoming very concerned about Regina's whereabouts with the phone calls and the information that we received. We were pretty sure that there was going to be foul play involved.
2 weeks later, Carolyn told Detective Jackson that the man who had called her before wanted to set up another meeting at the same convenience store. Police traced the call to a nearby payphone. The caller had already fled. On April 23rd, police found a partial skeleton of a small female near a riverbank in Pasadena, Texas. They determined the young girl's age and weight was close to Regina's. Detective Suzanne Jackson brought Regina's dental records to the medical examiner.
I went to the ME's office with my information. We did a comparison on some dental x-rays and found that this particular person was not Regina.
Months went by with no leads. Regina's parents feared the worst. On October 12th, two boys were playing near a dirt road in Manville, Texas, 26 miles south of Houston. Close to the road, they came across a wood pile. They found something they'd never forget. Human remains. They ran home to tell their parents, who called police. Officers arrived and secured the area. They could not identify the body at the site. It was too badly decomposed, and there was no wallet or identification nearby. All police could guess was that the victim was a child or young adult. They hoped an autopsy would tell them more. The Pasadena, Texas detective traveled to the Harris County Medical Examiner's office, bringing Regina's dental records.
So you almost have a match right
The
there.
ME compared those records to x-rays taken of the corpse.
But then you get everything you can obviously.
They did not match.
It was a little disappointing, although we were very relieved that it was not Regina. Her parents at this particular point were concerned that we were going to be recovering a body and we were not going to be locating Regina alive, and they were ready for some type of closure at this point.
As the search continued in Texas through the fall of 1990, a farmer prepared to burn down his old barn in Bond County, Illinois. He hadn't been inside in years. The farmer climbed up into the hayloft to make one last check of the place. He looked through the abandoned building, but found only items long since discarded. Nothing seemed especially unusual or out of place. Then, something caught his eye. He looked closer at the strewn hay and saw a skeleton that appeared to be human. The farmer immediately called police. In October of 1990, as Detective Jackson hunted in Texas for 14-year-old Regina K. Walters, a decayed body was found in the hayloft of an abandoned barn in Bond County, Illinois. Agent Mike Sheely of the Illinois State Police responded to the scene.
I had received a call from the local sheriff's office in Bond County, Illinois, and they had instructed me that they had found a body in a rural setting near the interstate, Interstate 70, which is a major interstate that travels through Bond County.
Crime scene technicians conducted a thorough search of the barn. No clothes were found on or near the body. There was no wallet or other ID. They did find a single white thread close to the bones that seemed too new to have been in the old barn for long. Police photographed the remains from various angles. They found baling wire that matched the wire wrapped around the corpse's neck. Some hair remained on the head. Because the skull was so small, police believed the victim was probably a child. The people of nearby Greenville had not seen a murder in 10 years. The anonymity of this crime was especially disturbing. Police had no way of knowing if the victim was from the area or just dumped there by someone passing through on nearby Interstate 70. At first, they weren't even sure of the corpse's age or sex. Forensic anthropologist Mark Johnsey was called in to conduct an examination. He made several discoveries that helped Illinois State Agent Mike Sheely begin to identify the victim.
Mark was able to determine that it was a young female between the ages of 14 to 16, her approximate weight, which was 90 to 110 pounds. There was indication that her hair had been cut. The distal ends had begun to grow again, but the forensics had told us that it was recent.
The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The killer had almost severed the victim's head by twisting baling wire around her neck 16 times.
That's what we found.
From the condition of the joints and vertebrae, Johnsey discerned that the girl was killed almost a year before. A forensic scientist analyzed the white fiber found close to the body. Maybe it would yield a clue to what the young girl or her murderer had been wearing. He determined the fiber was mostly cotton, but it didn't come from clothing. It likely came from a towel. Searching the National Crime Database, State Agent Mike Sheely listed the Illinois Jane Doe as a white female, 14 to 16 years of age, probably killed as early as September 1989.
We were alarmed to find that there was 950 matches with the age group and the category and the time frame, which made the task very difficult to begin the identification process.
He narrowed the field to about 100 by specifying the victim's time of death closer to the spring of 1990. The investigator then sent teletypes to law enforcement agencies working those cases. The detective investigating the disappearance of Regina Walters in Pasadena, Texas, received the teletype on October 16th. She believed the body's description fit Regina's and phoned the Bond County Sheriff's Office in Illinois. The receptionist told her they had gotten so many responses that the sheriff would have to call her back. Before she hung up, the detective remembered the mysterious phone call Regina's father had received. The caller had said the girl was in a barn.
When I asked her if the body was found in a barn, she immediately transferred me to the sheriff, in which I started talking to him right away. And it was immediately discovered that it was possibly Regina, and so we immediately jumped on that and started sending the teletypes back and forth.
The detective asked another question based on the March 17th phone call to Regina's father. Did the girl in the barn have shorn hair? The Illinois authorities confirmed that she did. The girl found in Illinois matched the caller's description of Regina.
We sent a copy of dental x-rays to Greenville, Illinois, to the sheriff's office, and those dental x-rays were matched with the body that was discovered there, and it was confirmed to be Regina's body.
One question remained. Where was Regina's boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones? Detectives called on the FBI for help. Special Agent Mark Young, a behavioral expert in the Houston field office, was assigned as case agent.
And I tried to go in and contact every person that had any involvement with Ricky or Regina. I wanted to see if there was anything that they mentioned that would have proven valuable to locating Ricky.
At his former high school, Pasadena, Texas detectives also continued to pursue Ricky Lee Jones.
That's right, you did. When you called, just a second, please.
A guidance counselor said that Jones had not been enrolled in school for the past year.
He was in school last round. Okay, do you have any information I need?
She had little other information about him, though she did provide his last known address.
That's pretty old.
It was the home of Jones's family. His sister Tammy was the only one there. She said that no one in the family had seen Ricky for over a year.
A year? You haven't seen him in a year?
They had written him off as a bad kid, believing he'd end up in prison.
A year?
The detective asked if they had relatives in Mexico. Tammy said her mother had some in Matamoros, just south of the Texas border.
Have you seen her?
Jackson showed her a photo of Regina, but Tammy didn't recognize her.
Okay, that's the last time. Has he left?
Ricky was already listed as wanted because he had violated his probation. So we felt like maybe he was afraid to come home if he did know anything about Regina's disappearance and her death. We were in fear that he may not want to call and tell us what had happened or may be involved himself.
As Special Agent Mark Young pored over the details of the case, he developed a profile of Regina's killer. The agent determined that 18-year-old Ricky Lee Jones probably did not commit the crime.
If Ricky Lee Jones had murdered Regina, he would have done it in a fit of anger, and that would have been reflected in the crime scene, and you didn't see that. It was a very controlled, purposeful crime scene. You got the impression that this is an older person, a white male, a traveler, truck driver, traveling salesman, somebody that had a reason to be across the country.
The fact that the barn was close to an interstate supported Agent Young's theory. The crime scene told the agent more about the sadistic murderer. He had stripped off Regina's clothing, killed her slowly by strangulation, and most notably, had cut Regina's long hair.
Whoever did this crime was doing things beyond what was necessary to perpetrate the crime. Maybe a sexual predator or sexual sadist, a person that had other offenses also.
Investigators were alerted to another crime in the town of Marshall, Texas, 200 miles north of Houston. Partial skeletal remains of a young man were found, washed up on a creek bank. The skull had been perforated on the left side by a small caliber firearm. Though there was little evidence to positively identify the body, the victim's age and location led police to conclude it was probably Ricky Lee Jones.
I came to the conclusion that there were no other leads to cover in this case. For all intents and purposes, the case was closed in our division. We had nowhere else to go.
To investigators, it looked like the man who had killed Regina K. Walters and her boyfriend had gotten away with murder. As the hunt for a sadistic killer ground to a halt in Pasadena, Texas, 1,000 miles west in Arizona, authorities encountered a problem on their own highways. An Arizona highway patrolman was at the end of his shift when he came across a tractor-trailer parked on the side of an interstate on-ramp. The rig had to be moved. It was a hazard to passing motorists. He noticed the lights were on and the engine was still running. As he approached the driver's door, Officer Michael Miller recalled that a man suddenly burst out of the cab and immediately spread his arms against the truck.
And I asked him, I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Nothing, officer, we're doing just fine." He said, "There's no problem. I've got a gun in my back pocket." And he motioned to his back pocket and then put his hands up on the side of his truck. This was kind of an unusual situation. And I could still hear the woman screaming on the inside of the truck.
Miller cuffed Robert Ben Rhodes and escorted the trucker back to his car to question him further.
He said it was just fine. They were there together in a, I guess you would call it, consenting situation. And but I didn't know if the screams coming from the woman were the fact that she was startled, she was surprised, but I was going to find out what the situation was.
With Rhodes's hands cuffed behind his back, Miller seatbelted him into the patrol car. The officer returned to the truck to check on the frantic woman. He found her handcuffed to the walls by her wrists and ankles. The patrolman assured her she was no longer in danger.
I told her, "Ma'am, you're going to need to remain here until I can get some help out here, because this is a criminal or a crime scene, and some detectives are going to have to look at this." I said, "Just remain calm. This man is not going to be back to bother you again. Just remain calm." I left the truck and moved back to my patrol car.
Miller returned just in time. Rhodes had maneuvered his cuffed hands in front of him and released his seatbelt. He was about to open the car door. The officer quickly recuffed him.
There is no actual routine stop out there in the road that no matter what you come across out there, you never know who you're dealing with. And it kind of sent a chill up my spine to know that if this man, as cool as he was, could have probably killed me and the girl at the same time and still been on the road.
Police from the town of Casa Grande arrived on the scene. They freed the woman and transported her and Rhodes to the police station for further questioning. Inside the truck, they found a gruesome array of torture tools. Chains that attached to rings welded to the back of the sleeper compartment, fishhooks, bloody towels, a horse bit, and a briefcase filled with the implements of a sexual sadist. They also found a camera in the briefcase, along with several hairs that did not belong to the woman found in the truck. Casa Grande Police Detective Rick Barnhart led the investigation.
Robert Rhodes had what I refer to as a rape kit in his truck. He had all kinds of paraphernalia. He had long sticks with clips on the end where he would draw and quarter his victims. He had whips. And just based on that, I knew Robert Rhodes was a predator.
Just north of Phoenix, the truck stopped.
The woman found chained in Rhodes's truck was 27-year-old Kathleen Vine.
I've never had any problems before.
She told the detective she had been picked up about an hour earlier from the Rip Griffin's truck stop north of Phoenix.
He was trying to rape.
When she dozed off in the sleeper compartment, the trucker climbed back, assaulted her, and chained her to the walls. The man told her his name was Whips and Chains, and that he'd been doing this for 15 years. Police photographed her injuries, wrist burns from the handcuffs, and welts from the beatings. She tried to fight off her attacker, but her hands were chained. All she could do to defend herself was to bite him. She managed to injure his left shoulder enough to distract him from raping her. Kathleen agreed to press assault and kidnapping charges, but Detective Barnhart believed she might be problematic for the prosecution.
My interview with Kathleen was really sort of bizarre. She would talk about this reality, this terrible assault that she endured, and then periodically she would revert back to a story about her traveling across the country to see the president. She told me she wanted to give the president a microchip, and she talked about the underground prison where no one escapes from. And all this time my heart was sinking because I needed Kathleen to tell a very lucid story about the horrible incident that happened to her.
The detective asked trucker Robert Ben Rhodes for his version of events. Rhodes said Kathleen was crazy and described her as a lot lizard, the trucker's term for a woman who trades sex for rides. He claimed that she solicited him and that she liked it rough, though they never actually had sex. He refused to provide any details about what happened in the truck's sleeper compartment. He talked around the subject, never admitting to any crime.
Can you please remove your...
Police photographed Rhodes's wound. It looked like a bite mark on his left shoulder, just as Kathleen had described. Rhodes claimed he sustained the injury while loading his truck, but Detective Barnhart believed Kathleen's story.
She told me she tried to bite his throat, but he moved and she bit him on the left upper shoulder. And we've got a photo of her bite mark, and her story completely corroborated, what happened in that sleeper cab.
Local prosecutors arrested Robert Ben Rhodes and held him for aggravated assault, sexual assault, and unlawful imprisonment. But their only witness, Kathleen Vine, suffered from paranoid delusions. To keep him behind bars, they needed additional witnesses. Kathleen's claim that Rhodes had been kidnapping women for 15 years haunted Detective Barnhart. He entered Rhodes's name into the NCIC in case other agencies had reported similar crimes. As the detective pursued the case, it made headlines across the Southwest. A Houston police officer was among those who read about it. The trucker detained in Arizona sounded like the same man who was stopped outside of Houston earlier in the year. Police suspected Rhodes had held a woman captive in his truck for 6 days, raping and torturing her until she finally escaped. They were unable to press charges since the woman failed to identify him. Houston Police Sergeant Bomar described the case to Detective Barnhart.
I was contacted by Sergeant Bomar. His was the case where the young lady escaped. I was fairly positive that Robert Rhodes was at least a serial rapist. I had suspicions that he might be a murderer.
Since Rhodes had crossed state lines since his last crime, Detective Barnhart contacted the FBI to request assistance. He hoped that with the FBI's support, he could gather enough evidence of the trucker's serial sex crimes to build a case that would stick. Special Agent Bob Lee of the Houston FBI field office knew the place to start was in Rhodes's Houston apartment. He spoke to Rhodes's landlord. She had checked the apartment after the trucker's arrest and was horrified to find bloodied torture devices. Based on her statement, Agent Lee secured a warrant to search the premises.
We know that serial rapists often keep souvenirs from their victims, whether it be a piece of clothing or a piece of jewelry or whatever. When we went in, we found bondage paraphernalia, we found chains, we found handcuffs, we found a rack that someone could be tied to. We found a lot of women's jewelry.
Agents and Houston police also found bloody white towels, women's clothing, and stacks of photographs. The snapshots depicted some women with shorn hair in various states of undress, bound and bruised. Investigators believe that Rhodes shot the photos as souvenirs of his crimes to relive his victims' terror. Though agents now had evidence that Rhodes was likely a serial rapist, they were unable to identify any of his victims from the photos. With no additional witnesses, the case in Arizona was still weak. Prosecutors' only witness, Kathleen Vine, was questionable. The trial would be a contest of he said, she said, and a mentally disturbed woman might leave jurors unconvinced. By December 1990, the best Arizona prosecutors could do was to offer Rhodes a deal. 6 years, including time served and work release eligibility, if he pled guilty to the charges against Vine. His attorney accepted. In about a year, Rhodes could be out on parole, stalking new prey. By October 1991, a year after 14-year-old Regina K. Walters was found murdered in Illinois, her case remained unsolved. Special Agent Mark Young, an FBI profiler, predicted the murderer was probably a trucker or traveling salesman with prior sexual offenses. His signature behavior was to hack off his victim's hair. Agent Young spoke to area law enforcement agencies hoping they had open cases that might match the profile.
One day, Bob Lee, who was an agent in the FBI on the Violent Crime Squad, overheard me talking on the phone to a police officer. And he said, hey, I had a case I had worked a few months back where a truck driver kidnapped a young girl and her head hair was cut just like you're saying.
The victim's name was Nicole Tuttle. She had also been raped repeatedly and had escaped the day Regina Walters and Ricky Lee Jones were last seen alive, on Monday, February 5th, 1990. That same day, Houston police had stopped a trucker named Robert Ben Rhodes, who fit Nicole's description of her attacker. At the time, she told the officers it was the wrong man. Special Agent Bob Lee from the FBI's Houston field office recalled that Nicole later changed her story in the hospital where she was treated for her wounds.
Later that night, she told the detectives that Robert Ben Rhodes was in fact the individual that had kidnapped her. When asked if she wanted to press charges, she told the police officer that all she wanted to do was go home.
Lee also told Agent Young that Nicole was not the trucker's only victim. Rhodes was serving time in an Arizona prison for the assault of Kathleen Vine and was eligible for work release in just 3 months. The agent then described the search of the trucker's residence.
And he said, we found some photographs in his apartment, some of his own pictures, with somebody else with short hair, who it seems like she was at a barn.
The chilling photos portrayed a young girl at different locations, wearing a variety of seductive outfits. At the barn, she was in a black dress, shielding herself from Rhodes's camera.
When I saw those photos, I said, this is Regina Walters. In order to verify that, I went to the family and I got several of their pictures, and there are facial characteristics and markings that exactly duplicated the pictures Rhodes took.
The FBI began to build a kidnapping and murder case against Robert Ben Rhodes. They revisited the evidence from the search of Rhodes's apartment and found more photos of Regina. They also found several articles of women's clothing, including a black dress, which lab examiners confirmed was the dress Regina had worn in the photos. Illinois State Agent Mike Sheely was notified. He forwarded the evidence found in the Greenville barn to the FBI lab in Houston. Lab examiners discovered that the cotton fiber recovered in Illinois was consistent with the bloody towels found in Rhodes's Houston apartment, but the results were inconclusive since that type of towel was so common. Detective Jackson from Pasadena, Texas, met with agents Sheely, Young, and Lee at the Houston FBI field office to discuss what they needed for a solid indictment against Rhodes, not only for Regina's murder, but for crimes against his other nameless victims. With Rhodes nearing his release date, Illinois State Agent Mike Sheely knew they were racing against the clock.
He was eligible for parole, and that he was actually eligible to work outside the prison almost on a release system. And so we were under pressure to have the indictments and to get him arrested on our charges.
You have a seat here.
Agents interviewed Rhodes's former Houston employer, Mike Eggleton. The trucking firm owner was not surprised to see him. Eggleton had been questioned by authorities about Rhodes before. A few years back, local police suspected the trucker of assaulting a woman in the back of his rig, but no formal charges were ever filed. The truck Rhodes had driven had been sold, but Eggleton provided its vehicle identification number, as well as Rhodes's trucking logs and fuel receipts. While agents waited for a trace to come back on the truck's ID number, the team began to assemble a timeline of the trucker's travels. Agents found fuel receipts from a gas station in Ennis, Texas, dated March 17, 1990, the same place and date as the call made to Regina's father, Jerry Walters.
Oklahoma City.
Several of the local calls to Regina's mother, Carolyn, also coincided with Rhodes's time in Houston. One question about the calls remained. The killer could easily have gotten Carolyn's number from missing persons flyers posted around town. But how had he gotten Jerry Walters' unlisted home number? Agent Young found the answer in evidence stored in Arizona.
It was in that evidence that we located Regina Walters' little spiral notebook. And the front cover was all of her personal information, her mother's address and phone number, and her father's.
When Young flipped the notebook over, he found something even more disturbing. A message that he believed was written by Rhodes himself. A knife and gun were drawn above a phrase that appeared to have blood dripping off its letters. The phrase read, "Ricky's a dead man." Only a DNA test would confirm if the partial remains of the young man found in southeast Texas was Ricky Lee Jones. Unfortunately, investigators lacked a known source of Jones's DNA to perform a comparison.
And everywhere else.
Since Rhodes claimed to have been abducting and torturing his victims for the past 15 years, the team submitted their timeline to VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, an FBI database that lists thousands of solved and unsolved crimes nationwide. Despite the limited information and gaps in the timeline, Detective Jackson was not surprised when the system returned over 50 possible matches with open homicide and missing persons cases.
His trips from Houston to Baltimore to LA and back in a matter of 4 to 5 days at a time could just give you an idea of how many people he has access to and remote locations that he could abuse these people and dispose of them.
A week later, agents tracked down Rhodes's truck in Houston. 2 years had passed since Rhodes had driven the rig. The cab had since been steam cleaned, repainted, and used by other drivers. But evidence of his crimes somehow survived. Investigators recovered a single strand of head hair that was consistent with Regina's. Miraculously, they also found a small fingerprint on the vinyl upholstery in the sleeper compartment that matched her prints. That proved she had been in the truck, but it did not prove when or whether she'd been there against her will. By January of 1992, almost 2 years after Regina had disappeared, investigators determined the evidence was not decisive enough to prove interstate kidnapping. They dropped the federal case. With Rhodes's parole hearing just a week away, investigators convinced the Bond County prosecutor to press charges in Illinois for capital murder. They knew the evidence was circumstantial, but they pressed on.
I feared that he could escape, and I also believe that due to the overcrowding in the prison systems and those sort of things, that he could be released.
On February 6th, investigators traveled to the Arizona State Prison in Florence to serve the warrant to Rhodes. Their plan was to confront Rhodes with photos of Regina, hoping to prompt a confession. An incriminating statement would bolster their case. The suspected serial killer was unfazed, even smug.
We spent approximately an hour with him, but Rhodes was unwilling to speak with us and denied any involvement in the death, and was very firm in his denials. And at that point, we knew that we were going to have to prove our case.
Agents believed Rhodes knew they were fishing for a confession because their evidence was weak. They suspected this arrogant man was betting he could beat the charges. Maybe he believed that they didn't care enough about his victims to earn a conviction.
A lot of serial offenders, whether they're killers or other sexual predators, will pick victims that they consider the forgotten people. Because they're banking on that element that law enforcement and society doesn't really care about hitchhikers or less wealthy people, less established folks. He preyed on that type of person in the hopes that he wouldn't get the attention that did happen.
Almost 2 years after the death of Regina K. Walters and the kidnapping and sexual assault of at least 2 other women, Robert Ben Rhodes was extradited from Arizona to stand trial in Illinois. He and his attorney managed to delay the trial date for 6 months. On September 11th, the overconfident trucker lost his nerve. In a Bond County, Illinois courthouse, his attorney pled down the capital murder charge that carried a possible death sentence. He accepted an offer of first-degree murder with a penalty of life. Rhodes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even as he serves his time in the maximum security prison in Chester, Illinois, investigators have not abandoned the case. They continue to gather evidence, committed to proving that Regina K. Walters was not Rhodes' only murder victim.
There is one other picture of a female as yet unidentified that got into the truck with him. We're somewhat concerned whether that may be another victim. Anybody that gets into the comfort zone of the truck of a serial killer may potentially be another murder victim.
Investigators continue to work on identifying the unknown women from Rhodes's past in hopes of bringing the small comfort of closure to their grieving families. In the 1990s, a close-knit immigrant community was terrorized by one of its own. Those who turned to the police for help found themselves threatened. or killed. Despite the risk, 2 men refused to back down. Their testimony could help end the killing if the FBI got close enough to uncover one man's deadly business.
Many immigrants escape the poverty of India to start new lives in the United States. Most dream of a better life for their families. One twisted the American dream into a nightmare. When people started turning up dead in New York's Indian community, law enforcement struggled to link fraud and murder to one powerful man. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When the promise of the American dream was shattered by murder and corruption, the FBI provided hope to those people who had seen their lives and families torn apart.
July 9th, 1995. Gas station attendant Kulwant Singh commuted to a gas station in the Bronx to work the late shift. Less than a year earlier, he had arrived in New York from a poor town in India, hoping to make a better life for himself and his family. That night, he disappeared. In October, the missing man's brother, Manmohan Singh, traveled to the U.S. to find him. He hadn't heard from his brother in months. It wasn't like him not to write or call. He began his search in Queens at the address of one of his brother's friends. His name was Satinderjit Singh. His family was from the same village as the missing attendants. Although this friend had the same last name, he was not related. Like many members of the Sikh religion, Satinderjit took the surname Singh, which means lion in the Punjabi language. Satinderjit said a missing persons report had been filed, but police had found no trace of his friend. He advised the new arrival to be careful who he talked to. Searching for the brother would be dangerous. Manmohan visited the gas station in the Bronx where his brother had worked. He spoke to an attendant, but the man was afraid to respond.
My brother's missing. I'm sorry. I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him?
His supervisor made it clear that no one should be asking questions. The employee was instructed to keep quiet. But Manmohan was persistent and convinced the attendant to meet him at a diner a few days later.
I can only be here for a few minutes. I know you're looking for him.
The attendant said the missing brother had been accused of stealing from the gas station.
And he was coming in to
Whether or not the allegations were true, they had made the station's owner angry. The attendant believed Manmohan's brother had been kidnapped and probably killed. By March of 1997, a year and a half after his brother's abduction, Manmohan took a job at a gas station in New York. He worked nights so he could spend his days secretly gathering information. He believed he knew who was responsible and was ready to go to the police.
Yeah, I need some oil.
Then, on the night of March 16, 1997, he was silenced. Brooklyn North homicide detectives received a call from a customer who found the body.
105, 1025.
They photographed the crime scene to record its condition, then gathered evidence. They collected 2 shell casings from a 9mm Ruger. Detectives found the register had been robbed, but were surprised that the thief had left some cash behind. Police also found no fingerprints. Detective Tony Brizada concluded that robbery was not the prime motive.
We examined the scene, and it looked like it was a typical gas station robbery at the beginning, but then examining the scene thoroughly, it seemed that it was more like an assassination, or this person was a target because he was shot very close range behind the head, and he was on his knees.
Detectives visited the Sikh temple where the funeral was being held. They knew this immigrant community was wary of outsiders, but hoped to find friends of the victim willing to talk.
Good, how you doing?
Satyendra Singh stepped forward. He told detectives that he knew the slain man. Detectives explained that without cooperation, the killer would likely go free.
Okay.
Although he knew he was jeopardizing his own safety, he promised to meet with detectives and help them in any way he could. The following day, Satyendra Singh came to the police station as promised.
Yes, sir.
He brought with him another witness, Sarvjit, who was also willing to talk. They told detectives they believed a wealthy and powerful Indian man named Dinza had ordered the murder of their friend, as well as the abduction of their friend's brother. Dinza was a corrupt and ruthless businessman who was well known in the Sikh community. Like many others, he had come to the U.S. from India in the mid-1980s with only a few dollars in his pocket. But his story was different than most. He had amassed an empire of more than 50 gas stations in and around New York City.
And which was common with all the...
The witnesses knew several of Dinza's employees and explained to Detective Teddy Braun that the millionaire would stop at nothing to protect his business.
His whole thing was fear. He used the fear tactic that he had this community petrified of him. I mean, to the point where he could walk in and do something in front of hundreds of people and no one's going to say nothing.
Police also learned that Dinza was no stranger to crime. His record included convictions for felony assault, kidnapping, robbery, gas pump fraud, and weapons possession. He'd served time, but always managed to get back on the street to run his mafia-style operation. Within the Sikh community, Dinza was known as the Indian Godfather. The witnesses said Dinza's empire was a family affair, with Dinza's brother a member of the inner circle and an enforcer for the organization. Sarvjit had seen for himself just how ruthless the brother could be. In 1993, outside a Queens restaurant, the informant witnessed Dinza's brother arguing with a man. The disagreement ended with Dinza's brother shooting him at close range. Sarvjit rushed to the victim's side, but it was too late. Dinza's brother was spirited out of the country to India. He was never captured. The witnesses now told the detectives that they'd heard the brother would soon be returning to America. They were risking their lives talking to police, but they couldn't let the violence continue.
Yes, sir.
Both promised to report when Dinza's brother arrived.
He's going to be coming back to the United States because Dinza's company was getting so big that Dinza needed another hand. And Dinza was the type of person where he'd rather have family hands-on than outsiders when it came to his money.
True to their word, in May of 1997, the witnesses told police that Dinza's brother was back in New York. Police set up outside the warehouse of Dinza's headquarters in Brooklyn, waiting for his brother to arrive.
In front, it's clear.
Both witnesses were present to assist police with identifying the murder suspect.
We have a possible target. Stand by.
Armed with an arrest warrant, police surrounded the building and cordoned off all entrances, including the back doors of the warehouse. From the surveillance van, Satinderjit confirmed that it was Dinza's brother heading for the front door.
We have a target entering the building.
Moments later, officers reported that shots were fired inside the building. They held their posts, waiting for orders.
Ready? We're going in. Let's go.
Officers forcibly entered the front of the building. 3 men raced out the back door into the hands of police. The men were Dinza's brother, his cousin, and his nephew. All 3 were arrested. Quickly securing a search warrant, police confiscated firearms, 7 pistols, a shotgun, and a silenced machine gun. As they loaded the contraband into a police car, Dinza himself arrived at the scene. He protested the seizure, claiming that the building and guns were his property. But the guns were illegal. Police arrested him on weapons possession charges. They took him to the 112th precinct, where Dinza was booked and fingerprinted. Police pressured him to cooperate. They had 2 witnesses who would testify against him and his brother for murder. Insisting he was innocent, he refused to talk. Dinza was held in the Brooklyn Correctional Facility awaiting a bail hearing. But incarceration did not prevent the murder suspect from running his empire. Speaking in Punjabi so guards couldn't understand him, he coerced employees and acquaintances to find out who dared to testify against him and his brother. Besides witness statements, police had little other evidence. Dinza would be out on bail shortly. If he discovered the identity of the witnesses, they might not testify. Then, the murder and weapons charges against the brothers would have to be dropped. In May 1997, New York City police arrested 2 East Indian brothers who had been terrorizing their immigrant community for years. Except for the statements of 2 witnesses, investigators had little evidence against them. But they believed that Dinza was the ringleader and that he had ordered 2 murders and a kidnapping. Dinza had posted bail on May 4th, 1997, just days after his arrest. But his brother remained held on a murder charge in New York City's Rikers Island prison. Through informants, Dinza had learned the identity of the 2 witnesses against him. If they continued to cooperate with the police, he, his brother, and his multi-million-dollar gas station empire would be in jeopardy.
Okay, tell me a little bit more.
One of the witnesses, Satyendra Singh, was close with several employees of the suspected murderer. He knew a great deal about how Dinza ran his $60 million gas station chain. He said that Dinza rigged pumps, skimmed profits, and ordered people abducted if they talked.
What did you know about Dinza, what you told?
Detectives believed the information was compelling enough to seek an indictment. In early June of 1997, investigators met with the assistant U.S. attorney to explore Dinza's illegal activities. NYPD detective Teddy Braun explained how Dinza's pump rigging scheme worked.
Dinza owned like 53 gas stations, and he had this unique skimming system. And what it did was it regulated the amount of gas that was pumped into a consumer's vehicle. So if you would have went in and asked for $10 worth of gas, he'd be able to set up that machine where it can give you 80%, 90%, whatever percent that he wanted to give you, and the rest would be saved.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell learned that not only was Dinza's empire corrupt, it was extensive.
The NYPD informed us that Dinza had, among other things, an organization built around pump fraud, basically ripping off customers at his gasoline stations throughout the New York and New Jersey area, by which he generated millions of dollars in income. That he protected that pump fraud activity through a pattern of violent crime, including murder.
On June 18th, just as the federal investigation was beginning, witness Satyendra Singh was shot to death in Queens. It was the day before Dinza's brother, suspected of murder, was scheduled to attend a hearing. At the crime scene, a neighbor told police he had witnessed the crime. He had been outside at the top of his stoop when the shooting took place. Since his apartment lacked air conditioning, he was watching a Mets game on his front porch. He was distracted by what appeared to be a traffic dispute. The neighbor described the shooter as a tall African-American male, but he never saw his face. The slain man's cousin was sitting beside his relative in the car when he was killed. The cousin told police it had all happened so fast. He was too shaken to remember any details. Forensic technicians photographed the scene. They collected shells that had been fired from a 9mm handgun. No other physical evidence was found. Nothing to prove that Dinza was responsible. Investigators believed that Dinza would continue to use any means necessary to protect his millions. They needed some way to stop him. NYPD detectives turned to Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell for guidance. He would refocus the investigation to take advantage of the federal RICO statute, the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, a law used to prosecute organized crime.
This looked like, had all the hallmarks of a racketeering prosecution. It had an organization with leadership, it had racketeering activity which generated income, and it had a pattern of criminal activity which spanned several years, almost a decade.
This would widen the scope of the investigation considerably. The Assistant U.S. Attorney called on the FBI for help. Special Agent in Charge Kevin Donovan from the FBI's New York field office worked the case.
The FBI was planning on conducting a traditional organized crime investigation that would focus on development of cooperating witnesses, use of cooperating witnesses, review of records, and search warrants to focus on the multiple acts of violence and the multiple acts of fraud.
That would not be easy. In order to develop new witnesses, agents would have to ensure the safety of those who came forward.
As long as Dinza Singh was able to intimidate witnesses through violence, threats of violence, and homicides, our investigation would be very limited. We needed to make sure that no other individuals who would cooperate with us would be hurt by Dinza Singh.
News of the most recent killing spread quickly through the Sikh community. The other witness, Sarvjit, and his family prepared to leave town. Investigators pleaded with him to allow the FBI to place him under protective custody. But he insisted on taking his wife and 2 small children away from New York. Despite investigators' best efforts, Dinza had intimidated another witness. To the Sikh community, the police and the FBI seemed powerless to protect them. In the summer of 1997, the FBI was on the trail of a violent businessman named Dinza. Investigators believed he had already killed 2 men, kidnapped a third, and scared another out of New York. They needed an informant close to Dinza to get enough evidence to arrest him.
I will get back to you.
But Special Agent in Charge Kevin Donovan found that Dinza was well protected.
The major hurdle that the FBI and the New York City Police Department had to overcome was an inability to develop cooperating witnesses and informants early on due to language difficulties and due to the fact that most of the individuals who worked at City Gas Corporation were not willing to come forward because of Dinza Singh's threats of violence and his acts of violence that were well known throughout the community.
Dinza now threatened the life of another member of the Sikh community. Balwant Singh was close friends with the witness who had fled the city with his family. The man was terrified. Dinza had come after him to find the one remaining witness. He remained holed up in his apartment with his wife and daughter for 3 days before he finally called police. He reached the Queens Homicide Unit, which was investigating the murder of Satinderjit Singh, a witness against Dinza. Balwant told police that he had attended the slain man's funeral. There he was approached by one of Dinza's men. He asked Balwant where the other witness was hiding. Dinza wanted to discuss the witness's testimony face to face. Balwant refused to tell him anything. But now he feared for his own life. Police told him that they would discuss the possibility of providing him and his family with protective custody. 2 detectives would be right over. Since the funeral, he had been ignoring the demands of the construction company he owned.
Mr. Singh, please.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Singh. Needed down here at the office.
When the company called, he agreed to run an urgent errand. He left his frightened family, promising he'd return as soon as he could. He knew Dinza's reputation. It would be difficult to avoid him for very long. Just minutes after pulling out, the man noticed a sedan that seemed to be following him. It was Dinza. Balwant didn't want to take any chances, so he returned home. Dinza sped away. As detectives headed for Balwant's apartment, they received a page. It was a coded message from their supervisor, asking them to call in immediately. Lacking a cell phone, they stopped to make the urgent call. While the detective was on the phone, he noticed an Indian man watching him closely from a car. He decided to investigate. The detectives asked the driver for his license and registration. It was Dinza.
Mind stepping that, sir?
When detectives asked to search his car, he agreed. Inside, they found some gas receipts. In the trunk, detectives also found electronic gauges for gas pumps. Dinza possessed nothing that was illegal. Since there was no outstanding warrant for his arrest, detectives let him go. The detectives were called away on an emergency. They never made it to the informant's home that day. The next morning, the man's frightened wife called police. Her husband had taken refuge in a friend's gas station. He waited anxiously for them to arrive and was relieved to see them pull up. His wife and daughter were picked up moments later. That evening, the family was taken to an undisclosed hotel outside of New York. The family would hide there under police protection until Dinza could be arrested. Detectives informed Balwant that they had run into Dinza near his neighborhood. They asked if he could verify the man's identity from a photo. Balwant identified him instantly. Investigators had one more witness in their case against the deadly businessman, but they still lacked sufficient evidence to make an arrest. In July of 1997, FBI agents and NYPD detectives believed gas station mogul Dinza was the man behind the murders of 2 Indian immigrants and the disappearance of a third. Investigators had little evidence to prove their theory, and Dinza's intimidation had silenced most witnesses. But a few among the community were tired of living in fear. At the end of July, Brooklyn North homicide detective Teddy Braun interviewed a source close to Dinza.
During the interview with the confidential informant, my partner Tony Pizzata came across a name Marvin, who was linked as Dinza Singh's strong arm.
The man's full name was Marvin Dodson. He was a 35-year-old African-American male. Detectives discovered that he had an arrest record for illegal firearms.
Any of these men look familiar?
They showed a photo lineup to the cousin of the slain witness who was in the car when the shooting occurred.
You recognize any of these men?
He immediately identified Dodson as the gunman. Detective Anthony Pizzata now began searching for Marvin Dodson.
My partner and myself put together a list of various locations, like about 6 or 8 locations where he hung out, his residence, his relatives.
On July 4th, 1997, police cornered Dodson in a Queens neighborhood.
Marvin Dodson! Turn off your ignition! Throw your keys out the window now! Do it! Come out of the car, sir!
They arrested him and took him to the station.
Go to the door, do it. Stop.
Dodson agreed to testify against Dinza in return for a lighter sentence. On Sunday morning, July 6, 1997, Dodson and his attorney met with Queens homicide detectives, the assistant U.S. attorney, and the FBI. Dodson confessed that he had been hired by Dinza for the murder. Dodson said the plan to kill one of the witnesses began on May 18, 1997. At the time, Dinza had just been released on bail. Dodson would be the trigger man, hired to kill the witness scheduled to testify against Dinza and his brother. First, they picked up the murder weapon, a 9mm Ruger. The same caliber of shell casings were later collected at the crime scene. Dodson told investigators that Dinza then ordered him to hire a driver for the hit.
Go ahead and tell us a story.
Dinza's next move was to conduct surveillance of the witnesses. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell recalls that Dinza provided Dodson with all the information he'd need to get to Satyendra Singh.
He gave Mr. Dodson the address where Satyendra Singh lived, the license plate number to his vehicle, and instructed Mr. Dodson to watch Satyendra Singh and kill him at the first opportunity.
What do you do with the gun?
On June 18, 1997, Dodson received a phone call from Dinza. His boss told him that the witness needed to be dead before nightfall. Dinza's brother's hearing was the following day. The hit would send a message to everyone who considered testifying. Dodson said that he and his driver, Walter Jazz Samuels, met Dinza at one of his gas stations. Dinza provided them with a white van. They watched Satyendra house until he came out. He was with his cousin. The plan was to cause a disturbance so that Satyendra would pull over and allow the van to pass. When he did, the van blocked him from moving. Dodson shot the unarmed man 8 times at close range. The hitman's description of the events of that day corroborated a neighbor's statement to police. Dodson also told investigators that after the killing, he had returned the white van to Dinza's garage on Roosevelt Avenue. He gave the gun back to Dinza, who paid him and the driver $20,000 for the hit. On July 6, 1997, police approached the Brooklyn home of Walter Jazz Samuels, the man who Dodson claimed had driven the van.
Samuels.
They arrested him without incident.
New York City Police Department. Keep your head straight ahead.
Police learned that Samuels had a record of previous arrests. With Samuels in custody, investigators turned their attention to Dinza. The U.S. Attorney's Office believed agents and detectives now had enough evidence to indict Dinza on federal racketeering charges. Special Agent in Charge Kevin Donovan recalls that agents dispersed across the city to find him.
FBI agents and New York City Police Department detectives initiated surveillances at several City Gas Corporation gas stations in which Dinza Singh was known to frequent.
At 5 p.m. on July 7, 1997, FBI agents and NYPD detectives followed Dinza to his Foster Avenue gas station. When he arrived, they arrested him for murder, kidnapping, pump fraud, and obstruction of justice in aid of a corrupt organization. The entire case hinged on the testimony of Dinza's hitman, Marvin Dodson. But because Dodson was a murderer, the U.S. attorney still needed to substantiate his story with other evidence or witness testimony. They hoped that testimony would come from Walter Jazz Samuels, the man who Dodson fingered as his accomplice in the murder of Satyendra Singh. Samuels now told investigators he was not in the van at the time of the shooting. He claimed he was at a nearby restaurant. His story checked out. Investigators believed Samuels knew who drove Dodson on the day of the killing. But he wasn't talking, and neither was Dodson. Investigators needed something else to corroborate Dodson's story. They secured a search warrant for Dinza's Roosevelt Avenue gas station, the place where Dodson had returned the white van after the murder. They searched the entire premises, but found little other than stolen license plates. They believed they were probably used on getaway cars during the commission of crimes. But once again, they had no proof. They found nothing that could corroborate Dodson's story or connect Dinza to the murder. As the FBI and police continued to pursue evidence, Dinza was behind bars once again, pending a July 14th bail hearing. Investigators hoped Dinza's incarceration would encourage witnesses to come forward. It did not. As before, Dinza continued to rule with an iron hand.
Unfortunately, as a result of Dinza Singh's ability to make telephone calls from jail, he was able to continue to run his corporation and his business and to focus on threatening additional individuals who might have come forward to cooperate with the FBI and the New York City Police Department.
For the second time in 3 months, authorities held the suspected murderer behind bars. They hoped it would be his final arrest. But the millionaire hired a high-priced defense team, and the prosecution's entire case still hinged on the testimony of a confessed killer. In July of 1997, a man named Dinza had been arrested on federal racketeering charges that included murder and kidnapping to protect his corrupt business empire. It was his second arrest in 3 months. As he had before, Dinza directed his business and even threatened potential witnesses from a prison telephone. But this time, investigators were listening. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell was not going to let Dinza slip through his hands again. They had to keep him behind bars.
First, his conversation was in Punjabi, which is a very unique dialect, and it took us some time before we could find a Punjabi translator to translate those telephone calls. Secondly, he was not very overt in his conversation, so he was somewhat cryptic in his conversation with his colleagues.
The translations opened a rare view into just how tightly Dinza held the reins to his empire. Dinza attracted customers to his rigged pumps by advertising the lowest gas prices in New York. But his pumps provided less than a gallon for the price.
He was issuing routine instructions to the members of his office, telling them to change the price of gasoline at his various stations, to continue to order supplies for his company. In addition, he also gave them instructions about things to communicate to their attorneys and steps to be taken in order to try and get him out on bail.
As Campbell raced to find evidence to keep Dinza from making bail, police processed the suspect's car. They found business cards that linked Dinza to his hitman Marvin Dodson and Dodson's operative Walter Jazz Samuels. Police also recovered a list of names and addresses that appeared to be a hit list. The list included the home address of Sarvjit Singh, a federal witness who had fled the city with his family. Balwant Singh, who was under protective custody, had also made the list. 7 more men with Punjabi names appeared as well. It was just what investigators needed to keep Dinsa from making bail. While they did not know whether these men were dead or alive, they knew who might. Agents asked Walter Samuels about the list, hoping it would prompt his memory. He finally opened up. He said that Dinsa had planned to kill those 9 men. 2 of them, Balwant and Sarvjit, were federal witnesses. The other 7 were Balwant's family members. They were all still alive. Once again, agents would need to corroborate the story. Confined in the room next door, Marvin Dodson and his lawyer waited to be questioned.
Tell me what it means to you.
Dodson confirmed Samuel's story and added something else. He said that on July 3rd, just days before Dinsa's most recent arrest, Dinsa had purchased 2 used police cruisers as part of the assassination plan. Dodson had copies of the titles, which his lawyer now offered to the agent as proof.
Mr. Dinsa's plan was for Mr. Dodson and Mr. Samuels to pose as law enforcement officers and to stop Balwant Singh on the street along with members of his family and kidnap them and bring them to Mr. Dinsa at an undisclosed location.
You're going to try to cram all these people in.
Feeling the pressure and hoping to cut a deal, Samuels now told investigators the name of the man who drove the white van during the murder. His name was Evans Alonzo Powell. Because Powell had no arrest record, Dodson wanted to protect him. He had threatened Samuels not to give him up. On July 19, 1997, police arrested Powell on a Brooklyn street. He agreed to cooperate. Powell admitted that he had driven the van for the murder in Queens. Investigators finally had their corroborating witness. Powell also talked about another crime.
Tell us more about where...
Dinsa had ordered the murder of the Indian man who had traveled to America to search for his missing brother. Powell was present when Dodson killed the attendant at the Brooklyn gas station on the night of March 16, 1997. Detective Tony Brizada remembers Dodson's confession.
He admitted shooting him twice in the head, had him kneeling down. And he said he got paid by Singh for doing this. That Singh wanted this person killed. He didn't give him a reason, but he just wanted him killed.
Dinsa had paid Dodson just $4,000 for taking the man's life. Dodson stole money to pay Powell for being the lookout. Special agent in charge Kevin Donovan continued to gather evidence about Dinsa's pump rigging activities.
The FBI and the New York City Police Department executed a search warrant at the Foster Avenue City Gas station. The focus of our search was to identify and obtain evidence of the pump rigging scheme. As a result of the excavation of the area around the pump, electronic devices were located in a box that was used to control the pump rigging scheme.
Investigators determined that Dinsa manipulated the flow of gasoline to customers' cars through devices controlled by remote. Wired to the pumps and buried underground, the systems could be turned on or off at will. Detective Teddy Braun explains that Dinsa taught many of his employees when to turn them on and off.
You were taught how to work on remote. And what would happen would be if a person, like for instance, if a person came in for a gallon of gas for their lawnmower, what would happen was the gas attendant would hit a remote in his pocket, which was just like a car alarm remote. And what that would do, it would shut off the skimming system. And the system would go right up to perfect. so that when the gas attendant pumped a gallon worth of gas in a container, it was perfect. So there would be no question.
In late July of 1997, the FBI conducted an exhaustive search of Dinsa's Brooklyn warehouse headquarters. There they found his double books.
We discovered documents reflecting bribery payments to a corrupt Department of Consumer Affairs inspector. In addition, we also estimate the total value of Mr. Dinsa's pump fraud activities in the neighborhood of $40 million over 10 years.
By September of 1998, the body of the man abducted from a gas station in the Bronx in 1995 was still missing. But agents had a hunch. Based on New York City construction records at the time of his disappearance, agents suspected that Dinsa had buried the attendant underneath one of his gas stations.
It was determined that the most likely gas station that was under construction at that time was a gas station located at Farragut and Flatbush Avenue.
On September 16, 1998, investigators arrived at the station with heavy equipment. They employed ground-penetrating radar to help locate the body beneath the earth. They selected 2 separate sites where they believed the man might be buried.
The construction crew removed slabs of concrete, and the FBI, the New York City Police Department, examined these 2 sites that were located by the ground-penetrating radar.
Investigators never found the man's body. Though this news was disappointing, investigators were having better luck with other leads. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell subpoenaed Dinsa's cell phone records. They placed Dinsa at the time and place of Satyendra Singh's murder. Prosecutors were well armed when Dinsa's trial began in Brooklyn Federal District Court. They hoped to convict him on 29 counts, including capital murder. Savjit Singh, who assisted the investigation despite death threats, testified against the man accused of killing his friends. On March 2, 1999, after 2.5 days of deliberations, the jury found Dinsa guilty of 21 of the 29 counts. They included murder, attempted murder, and fraud. Dinsa was acquitted in the kidnapping of the man whose body was never found. On October 5, 1999, Dinsa received 8 life sentences without possibility of parole. He escaped the death penalty. Later that month, the same judge sentenced Dinsa's hitmen for their roles in the murders. For assisting in the conviction of Dinsa, their sentences were considerably lighter. Powell received 10 years, Samuels 12, and Dodson 18. But it was the conviction of Dinsa that was most satisfying to prosecutors.
Prosecution of Mr. Dinsa was a very, sort of personally for me, a very rewarding experience. We were able to step into a community that frequently does not turn to law enforcement for assistance, and to render some significant help to them in order to remove an individual who was, for lack of a better term, a plague on that community.
Like many immigrants before him, Dinsa arrived a poor man and was embraced by a community of compatriots. But he repaid their kindness with swindles and murder. For his greed and brutality, he will never be free again. It's Friday night in October of 1993. And in Northern California, 3 junior high school girls are having a slumber party. Halloween is around the corner, and the girls have been trying on different costumes in preparation for the upcoming holiday. Within seconds, their lives will change forever. October 1st, Polly Klass and Jillian Pelham were waiting for another friend outside of Polly's house in Petaluma, California. It was around 8:30 when Kate McLean and her mother showed up. The three girls were ready for fun. It was Friday night. There was ice cream in the fridge, and they were going to stay up all night long. This was going to be a party. No one had any idea of the danger that lurked so close by. The girls kept to Polly's bedroom, but they couldn't suppress the noise as easily. At about 9:45, Polly's mother, Eve Nickel, looked in on the girls and asked them to keep it down. She was suffering a migraine headache and thought she'd turn in early. Eve's bedroom was right across the hall from the girls, and although she had chided them about the noise, she was pretty sure it would only take a few minutes for the 12-year-olds to get noisy again. Before going to bed, Eve took her prescription pills to block out all distractions and get her fast to sleep. The party continued on for almost an hour before the nightmare began. It was around 10:30 when the intruder entered the room. At first, Kate and Jillian thought it was a joke. Then they saw the knife. He told them if they screamed, he'd slit their throats.
Whose house is this?
Immediately, he tied them up and started asking questions. He wanted to know which girl lived there and who else was in the house. Polly spoke up.
Money around this place.
The girls were terrified and crying. And he assured them that he wasn't going to hurt anyone, that he was only there for money.
Somebody else was supposed to be here.
But when Polly told him where some cash was hidden in a jewelry box, he made no attempt to find it. He gagged the girls and took the cases off some pillows to use as hoods. He made Polly get up and told the others to count to 1,000. By the time they were done, he said she'd be back. Then he took Polly Klass and disappeared into the night. Petaluma police officers were called to the scene after the girls managed to free themselves and wake Polly's mother. They responded in minutes. Investigators entered Polly's room and began to look around. The bedroom was in disarray and told of the events that had happened just minutes before. On the floor were binding materials, cut strips of cloth. The cords from the Nintendo game had been cut, and a strap that was clipped from a purse lay on the floor. Pillowcases were strewn about.
I know.
What Petaluma Police Detective Mike Meese saw wasn't encouraging.
I remember standing at the doorway to Polly's room and looking at these few bags of evidence that we had been able to collect and thinking that that was just such a pitiful amount. And I looked down at the rug and I talked to my partner, Larry Pelton, and said, "Let's take the rug." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "I don't know why, but let's just take the rug. We just don't have enough evidence."
FBI.
Police were in desperate need of assistance. Fortunately, help was on the way. After being contacted by the Klass family, the Federal Bureau of Investigation offered its expertise.
How about, have y'all talked to the mother?
Yes.
Shortly after midnight, the FBI appeared at the house of Polly Klaas. Typically, the Bureau handles kidnappings, and with 800 a year to investigate, they have plenty of experience. Because he was familiar with the community and experienced in kidnapping cases, Special Agent Ed Fryer became the lead investigator. But he knew something about this case was different.
It had all the earmarks of a stranger abduction case because the statements from the two girls were consistent. Stranger abduction cases are the hardest cases to solve, in my experience, because, again, there's no connection between the perpetrator of the crime and your victim, or the victim's family, or somebody even associated to the victim. It's a random act.
Surprisingly, a vast majority of kidnappings involved disgruntled family members. And though Polly's parents were separated, her father, Mark Klaas, was immediately cleared of any responsibility. Abductions involving total strangers are exceedingly rare and leave little for investigators to go on. In this case, however, there were witnesses.
Was his hair long or short?
A police sketch artist was called in from the San Rafael Police Department. For 2 hours, Jillian and Kate tried to recall the face of the man who had barged into the bedroom. The girls were still terribly upset, but they managed to give the artist a pretty good description. Authorities now had their first idea of what the stranger looked like.
His nose and mouth.
After 4 a.m., the girls were taken to the police station, and the FBI called in one of its special forces, the Evidence Response Team. Tony Maxwell leads the crew.
In looking at cases across the United States, we have found that when somebody is kidnapped, especially a young child, that they will generally be harmed within the first 24 hours. And probably within the first couple of days could even be killed. So time is of the essence. In that kind of work, the investigator needs to move quickly.
The Evidence Response Team is designed to provide forensic resources at a major crime scene. Their sole responsibility is to collect evidence. And they use the most sophisticated collecting equipment available to do it. An electrostatic dust print machine collects tiny hairs and fibers off the floor when a positive charge is passed over a sheet of mylar. Any loose debris clings to the mylar and is sent to a lab for careful inspection. Although the police department had already dusted for fingerprints, they had come up with nothing particularly promising. But they didn't have access to the same equipment as the FBI. The alternate light source was a new method that employed a unique fluorescent powder, which when combined with a distinct ultraviolet light and amber-colored goggles, could illuminate many things that otherwise would remain hidden. The team found 4 dozen fingerprints the police were unable to see using conventional equipment. But even those were of no use. They were attributed to family and friends. After hours of meticulous searching, something finally turned up.
Hey, we're still working on it. Do you have anything? Yeah, I have some ridge detail in the bedpost here. It looks like it's pretty good ridge detail.
A palm print that at the outset seemed like the first real piece of forensic evidence left behind at the scene.
That palm print was found on the bed, on a crossbar of a bed, where he apparently put his hand up for just a second to lean on it, perhaps to support himself as he was grabbing something. And with the alternate light source and the fluorescent fingerprint work that we did, we were able to see it, collect it, and then gather that for the laboratory.
At that time, the FBI's fingerprint database, AFIS, didn't contain palm prints, only fingerprints. But even a palm print won't catch a suspect. It will only identify one once he's captured. FBI Special Agent Mark Mershon explains.
People often think that when you have a fingerprint or a palm print that you quickly establish the identity of a criminal. The truth of the matter is, in most instances, you have to identify a suspect, have fingerprints for that suspect in order to compare with a latent fingerprint.
The hunt for the suspect prompted authorities to cover Polly's neighborhood inch by inch. By dawn, more than 100 agents and officers had begun a 24-hour search for Polly and her abductor. Helicopters and bloodhounds had been called out, and an all-points bulletin was issued by local authorities and the FBI. Systematically, the authorities searched every house in the neighborhood. Agents went to Polly's school to talk with teachers and students in the hopes that somebody might have some useful information. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood in pairs, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious that night. One by one, they interviewed all of Polly's neighbors. Several people recalled seeing a stranger around the neighborhood that fit the description given by the girls. Thomas Georges and his friends were on their way to the video store at around 9 o'clock that night when he noticed a stranger standing in the shadows in front of Polly's house. Thomas knew everyone in his neighborhood, but he had never seen this man before. Returning home a few minutes later, the boys saw that the stranger was still there. The description Thomas gave to the authorities matched the suspect they were looking for. Sean Bush was playing video games with some friends who lived in a small rental cottage directly behind Polly's house. It was about 10:30 when Sean happened to glance out the window. He was surprised to see a strange man on the back porch of Polly's house. He appeared to be going for the back door. His description of the man also fit that of the suspect. There were others who saw the suspicious man that night, but unfortunately none of them alerted the authorities. As Petaluma Police Chief Patrick Parks explains, time was working against them.
In stranger abduction cases of small children, there is no more critical factor than time. Time is absolutely of the essence. And for that reason, you have to get out as many resources as you can. You have to put out the word as far as wide as you can. You have to involve as many agencies as you can, get them focused, get their efforts channeled, and hopefully, bring about a successful resolution.
While officers continued to comb the neighborhood, FBI investigators began executing the standard operating procedure in cases like these. After eliminating family and friends as suspects, they focused on ex-cons who were registered as sexual offenders throughout Sonoma County. Gradually, they branched out to surrounding counties, carefully questioning and investigating each registrant. But nothing turned up.
This is a hard case to believe that it even happened. There's 3 girls, they're in a slumber party. They're playing games in their bedroom, in their home, in a typical community, in a typical city. And somebody can walk into your home, the sanctity of the home, the security of your home, and take your daughter if it wasn't impossible, was inconceivable.
The following day, the search for Polly Klaas had escalated into the largest manhunt in the nation. a massive community volunteer network was formed to assist authorities. While hundreds of citizens searched, others passed out flyers, trying to cover the entire city as quickly as possible. Back at the FBI's Trace Evidence Lab in Washington, D.C., forensic expert Chris Allen was carefully surveying the items collected from Polly's house.
I noticed that in untying the pieces of bindings, the thin nylon strips of bindings that were used to tie up Polly's girlfriends, that they had jagged edges to them. And I was able to line them up perfectly so that I was able to determine that these all came from one piece of cloth originally, and it was a piece of cloth like a lady's nightgown or a slip material.
Other pieces of evidence found in Polly's room were not so easy to classify. Tiny fibers collected with the electrostatic dust print machine proved to be a challenge to identify. After painstaking examination and comparison, Allen concluded that they had come from the interior carpet of an automobile. Eliminating the cars that could be accounted for at Polly's house, Allen suspected that these carpet fibers were most likely from the kidnapper's car. One more item Allen found was a little more personal to the suspect.
I found in the vacuuming of the area rug that was in Polly's bedroom that she was playing on with her girlfriends, a dark brown, forcibly removed head hair. And I say forcibly removed because it had a 3 or 4 millimeter root sheath on it, actually skin material that comes out of the scalp when the hair is forcibly pulled or yanked out.
If Polly had pulled a hair out of the suspect's head, it was evident that she didn't go without a struggle. But even a hair with DNA evidence couldn't bring investigators any closer to finding a suspect. The palm print lifted from the bedpost was sent to Michael J. Smith, a fingerprint specialist with the FBI. Examining the print under laser light, Smith determined that the print had enough ridge detail to photograph. But the light emitted from the laser turned the print orange, and Smith needed to capture a black print on a white background. He instructed the photographer to reverse the color so that the finished print would appear the way it would on a fingerprint card. Now the print was indelible and could be filed until a suspect was apprehended. Investigators had unearthed some solid evidence, but it wasn't enough. Time was running out, and Polly Klaas was still out there, somewhere. "48 hours after the abduction of Polly Klaas, her father, Mark, got a call.
Polly?
It sounded like Polly.
Okay, honey.
She told her father that she was in a hotel room somewhere, and that her abductor had stepped out for a moment.
Tell me where you are. Polly!
Then the line went dead. It offered the first glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, since Mark's line wasn't set up for a trace,
Detective Fryer,
all
please.
authorities could do was wait for another call. Word of the abduction spread rapidly. In 2 days, 50,000 flyers had been distributed. Community volunteers quickly organized a search command center to work in tandem with the police and FBI. It was an unprecedented grassroots effort. A telephone bank was manned 24 hours a day to field calls and tips. A copy of every lead that was phoned in was shared with the FBI and Petaluma police. Before long, the search center had screened 60,000 calls. Out of those, authorities were compelled to follow up on over 12,000 leads. Processing that amount of data would have been virtually impossible without help from an FBI computer processor.
The FBI just happened to have the Rapid Start team. It was relatively new concept with the FBI, where on an investigation with a high volume of information, we would computerize that information, essentially triage the value of the investigative leads and make the assignments and track the progress.
Even with so many leads, there was one in particular that investigators were anxious to follow up on. When Mark Klass received the first call, the FBI was powerless to do anything about it. The second time she called, they were ready.
Hello.
Like the previous call, it sounded like Polly,
How are you,
and
honey?
she could only talk for a short time before she had to hang up.
Where are you?
But it was long enough
Are
for
you
authorities to make a trace.
Polly. Got it.
The FBI had traced the call to a house 30 miles away. There hadn't been enough time to collect an army of agents. The job would have to be handled by a few. But something wasn't right. This was just a normal family home. There was no sign of Polly or her abductor.
What's going on?
A terrible realization dawned on the agents. When they sat down with one of the girls in the house, she confessed to making the calls. She admitted that friends from school had dared her to call and impersonate Polly. The entire incident had been a cruel joke.
This was the only indication we had after a week's time that Polly just might be alive still, and we all were poised and hopeful that this would yield a solution and her safe recovery. Of course, it didn't.
In mid-October, Kate and Jillian were brought in to give another description of the man who tied them up. A highly acclaimed forensic artist was flown in to make a second sketch.
It was pretty well cut.
The artist was known for relaxing witnesses enough to coax an accurate description from them. The girls were less stressed than they had been that night, and were able to give her more to work with.
No, they were
The second sketch was much more precise. This sketch looked like a person. New flyers were distributed immediately. There was no time to waste.
But if you look back at true stranger abductions, we have this rule of thirds. The children who are abducted, typically 1/3 are recovered alive, 1/3 are recovered dead, and 1/3 are simply never heard from ever again. That's what we faced in this particular investigation, and that, I think, was one of our motivations to keep the sustained effort up.
After a reward had been offered for Polly's return, authorities received a call demanding a $10,000 ransom. They traced the call to a Petaluma apartment building. This time, a SWAT team showed up in force. They were not going to take any chances.
FBI! FBI! Down! 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 Cover!
Once again, authorities and the family had been fooled.
Put your hand behind your back. Don't move. Do not move. Going on. Don't move.
20-year-old James Hurd was arrested for attempted extortion and posing as a kidnapper. It was a crushing blow for everyone.
It became very frustrating. It was certainly distracting towards the main thrust of the investigation, but you had to deal with it. There was no way around it. You could not ignore those things. And it certainly chewed up a lot of time and resource.
The family had been especially discouraged. A letter Polly's parents wrote to the kidnapper was published in the October 17th San Francisco Examiner. Whoever you are, wherever you are, please return Polly to her family. She belongs here. We miss Polly so much. We miss the twinkle in her eye and her sweet humor. We long to see her beautiful smile and hear her musical voice. They also addressed Polly. Our darling, if you can read this, please know that your mommy and daddy love you so much, and we will continue to search for you until we can hold you safely in our loving arms again.
I don't think I ever lost hope. So I had numerous contacts with Mark Class, with Eve, with members of the family, and that was a question posed to me many times. And my response was no. We have not lost hope. We will not lose hope.
Across the country, people wanted to see Polly brought home. Banners sprang up, and Americans began a candlelight vigil. Thousands donned ribbons of lavender, Polly's favorite color, to show their support of the search.
We conducted searches during the day, during the night. We had a 24-hour operation going. We conducted searches sunny days, on foggy days, rainy nights. Whenever the information came in, we reacted to that because in a case like this, physical evidence is crucial.
The search never stopped. The Navy and search and rescue experts joined the thousands of volunteers who were constantly looking. Police and volunteer task forces worked tirelessly. But it would be nearly 2 months before anything broke. November 28, 1993. It was 2 months after Polly Klaas was kidnapped that authorities got their first real lead. In Sonoma County, a sheriff's deputy was called out to the house of Dana Jaffe. It sat at the end of a long, winding drive off Pythian Road. Dana had been out inspecting her property when she noticed something unusual and thought it might be of use to investigators. She led the deputy through a densely wooded area to a clearing just a few yards from the long, winding drive to her house. Scattered in the woods were a few items that seemed somewhat suspicious. There was a large piece of silk cloth that had been fashioned into what appeared to be a hood. A couple of strips of packing tape were on the ground.
Yeah, it's about 2 months ago.
A pair of young girl's tights had been tied into a knot, and human hair was entangled in the knot. Other debris surrounded the area. Then Dana recalled the night she'd caught a trespasser on her property not far from where they stood. It was nearly 2 months before. It all started when Dana's babysitter, Shannon Lynch, had left Dana's house and was making her way back down the long driveway. A man was walking down the middle of the private drive. His stranded Pinto was off to the side. He said that he was stuck and insisted that she get out of her car and help. He also wanted to know what was up the drive. But Shannon immediately sensed something wasn't right. She'd later describe him as looking like a wild man. She drove on, leaving him there, determined to get to a phone. Shannon found a payphone about 2 miles down the road and hurried to call her friend. She was anxious to get a hold of Dana and warn her of the scary man trespassing on her land. Dana didn't waste any time. She grabbed her daughter and a baseball bat and took off down the hill. She saw the car, like Shannon had said, but the strange man was nowhere in sight. She continued down into town and called the police. A few minutes after midnight, 2 Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies showed up. Dana explained that she didn't really want the intruder arrested for trespassing. She just wanted him off her property.
Yeah, just fine.
The deputies found the trespasser a little agitated. There was alcohol on his breath, and he was sweating profusely. There were bits of leaves and brush in his hair, as if he'd been rolling around on the ground. He told them that he'd been out sightseeing when he realized that he was on private property. When he tried to turn around, he got his car stuck on the side of the drive. He blurted out that he'd been under the car trying to free it, but the deputies didn't believe it. The way his car was trapped, there wasn't enough room for a person to get underneath.
You gotta move on, you gotta go. 10, 2, 1003, 1000.
The deputies administered some roadside sobriety tests, but he passed them all. Looking in his car, they found some cans of beer in a plastic bag and a small duffel bag in the back seat. When they asked him if he'd been drinking, he actually opened a beer and began to drink it.
You'll need to pour that out, okay? Pour that out. Go ahead and pour the beer out, all right? We can't let you be drinking any of that.
They immediately made him pour it out and then told him they wanted to pat him down. He became extremely upset.
Leave me alone. Just keep that stuff away from me, all right? Cigarette out for me.
To make him comply, the deputies told him they would be within their rights to run him in on trespassing. After he'd heard this, he calmed down considerably. They searched him carefully and continued questioning him, but could find nothing incriminating. He was just odd. The deputies remained suspicious, but when they ran his license, it checked out. His driving record was clean, and he had passed the sobriety tests. They had held him for about 45 minutes already, and they had no legal means to detain him any further. There was nothing left to do but pull his car out and send him on his way.
Well, those look like tights, and they look like...
That had been 2 months ago, the same night that Polly Klaas had been abducted.
Nothing good, that's for sure.
A hood, bindings, a young girl's pair of tights. It was too much of a coincidence. Putting it all together, the deputy quickly put a call in to the Petaluma Police Department.
Dispatch. I'm up here on...
Within an hour, Detective Mike Meese and Agent Ed Fryer arrived to check it out.
I'll never forget the scene. It was late at night then. By this time, Mike Meese and I are standing up on the hillside there on Pythian on the road. It was beginning to get a little misty and foggy, and the rain started to come down. And we looked at each other, and we knew in our hearts that we had basically uncovered a very critical crime scene, that this was going to lead us to the resolution of this case.
After the evidence was collected, investigators immediately began searching the Pythian Road site for any signs of Polly.
We spent days searching the mountain with over 300 volunteers. I believe we had 25 to 30 search dogs, and we conducted extensive ground searches for Polly, believing that she was still alive, which was the premise that we were working on.
As the search commenced, everything began to snowball. Authorities checked with the Sonoma County Police to get the full report of the incident that happened on Dana Jaffe's property. The man deputies had questioned was Richard Allen Davis. Accessing his criminal record revealed he had recently been paroled from an 8-year sentence for kidnapping.
What we learned about Davis initially was 1976 he had been arrested for robbery and kidnapping and assault with intent to commit rape. We learned in 1978 he had been arrested for another kidnapping, as well as a couple of counts of assault with a deadly weapon. 1984 he'd been arrested for a kidnapping case, assault with a deadly weapon, including the use of a firearm, and armed robbery. You start reading these reports and realize, you know, hey, this guy's a bad actor. This is an individual certainly more than capable of being involved in a crime like this.
The arrest photo on file matched the girl's description. His mother lived in Petaluma, giving him reason to have been there. The pieces were falling into place. The items discovered near Pythian Road were immediately flown to forensic specialist Chris Allen in Washington. Of the most interest was a strip of cloth that was found in the woods. Allen was quickly able to confirm what detectives had suspected.
Essentially what we're trying to do is establish whether or not the cut edges would line up or match. The middle strips represent the fabric that was found at Polly's bedroom, which were used to bind Polly's girlfriends. Subsequently, on the second submission, we received the cloth that was found at the Pythian Road site. These all fit together like a puzzle with the edges and the pieces of fabric matching up end to end.
The strips meant more than likely Polly Klaas had been out at Dana Jaffe's after her abduction. Without a doubt, Richard Allen Davis had been there too. Though it wasn't enough to arrest Davis for kidnapping, detectives felt if they could just get him in custody, they could quickly gather the evidence they needed to tie him to Polly's disappearance.
Everything else fell away, and we focused on what we had with Mr. Davis, what happened out there at Pythian Road, and what we were going to do next.
When investigators discovered Davis had an outstanding warrant for breaking parole and DUI, they decided to bring him in. But he wasn't at home when they arrived. Then a deputy sheriff who was securing a perimeter around the area stopped a van. At the wheel was Richard Allen Davis. When the deputy realized who he had, he calmly called it in to the investigators back at the house.
Is there a problem, officer?
No, sir. Just sit tight, okay?
Authorities reported to the scene, and Detective Meese approached the van and asked Davis to step out.
Step out of the van?
He informed him that he was under arrest for violation of his parole.
No. I'm Detective Meese. I'm arresting you for
One thing I think it's important to understand how Richard Allen Davis was taken into custody, because it was such a low-key event, and because Mike Meese went ahead and handcuffed him. He did it in a very professional way, and he started a rapport going with Richard Allen Davis that later was very useful in bringing resolution to the case.
It had been 2 months since Kate and Jillian had seen the man who took Polly Klaas, but they had no trouble picking him out of a lineup.
Number one, step forward, please.
Even without the beard, his was a face they could never forget.
Number one, step back, please.
Though he'd been arrested for parole violation, Davis was questioned about the kidnapping. He vehemently denied any involvement, but authorities let Davis know that if he wanted to talk, the door was open.
So I took Davis into the hallway and I told him, I said, hey, look, what you need to know is we've got all the physical evidence it takes to make this case, and all you're looking at is a kidnapping right now. So if you want to talk about it, you got to let me know. And he made a non-committal response, didn't want to talk. And I remember patting my pockets looking for a business card, didn't have a business card with me, and I said, you know, I'm going to leave my name and number with those guys, meaning the correctional deputies, and if you ever want to talk about it, you know, give me a call.
Back at the FBI latent fingerprint lab, Mike Smith was comparing the palm print found in Polly's bedroom with one that had been taken from Davis since his arrest. This was a crucial piece of evidence. Matching the two prints would undoubtedly link Davis to the abduction. After careful examination, the results were called in to Agent Fryer.
I just got a call from FBI laboratory. They matched Davis's palm print to a palm print taken off of Polly's bedroom, or her bedpost. It was again one of those moments where there was butterflies in my stomach. Again, realized that this was really very powerful evidence. So I hung up the phone, and again, there was a lot of noise and commotion in the command post. I stood up and I asked everybody, "Can I have your attention, please? Can I have quiet for a moment?" I said, "We just got confirmation from our laboratory that we've matched this palm print taken from the bedroom to Davis. We can place him in the bedroom." And there was just a huge cheer from everybody. Papers were flying. It was just great news to everybody.
This is it. It's concrete. He was in her bedroom. We can prove it. We had him nailed down.
Though news of the matching print had gone public, Davis was being held in isolation and had not heard anything about it. Then one day, a friend of his showed up for a visit. He urged Davis to talk to authorities and tell them where Polly was. But Davis continued to deny responsibility. Then his friend gave him the news the rest of the nation had already heard. It came as a complete surprise. Davis realized it was going to be impossible to explain how his palm print got in Polly's bedroom. There was only one thing he could do.
In Davis's mind, he's now got to do something, and that is try to make whatever deal he can make with the authorities, because we know that he was in Polly's bedroom. We can put him there.
While on his way to the massive search for Polly near Pythian Road, Detective Meese was paged to call the jail. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, and Meese was anxious about what he might find out.
After this wait, Davis comes on the phone, and I recognize the voice. So I know it's him, and I said, he says to me, "Hey, I screwed up. I screwed up big time."
Detective Meese and Special Agent Larry Taylor met with Davis in the interrogation room, where Davis related the details of the night of October 1st. Though he was living in something like a halfway house, he had applied for an overnight pass to go visit his mother in Petaluma. Unable to find her house, he had a few beers and walked the streets of Polly's neighborhood. At one point, he was stopped by a man who wanted to sell him some marijuana. He decided to go ahead and buy the joint. In Davis's own words, he got really buzzed and went to the store for more beer. He soon found himself wandering the neighborhood aimlessly. He wasn't sure where he was or what he was doing. But Davis had come to the neighborhood prepared. He'd brought a bag packed with bindings and tape. Forensic experts were able to determine that he had cut the strips with a pair of scissors, a fact which implies intent. Then Davis said he randomly picked a house on the street and crawled into an open window. He remembered hearing TV voices and said he may have picked up a knife from the kitchen. He said he didn't remember anything after that. He claimed the next thing he knew, he was driving in his car and was surprised to find a young girl sitting next to him. She was complaining that her hands were tingling. According to Davis, he adjusted the straps for her and drove around wondering what he had done and what he should do next. Then he drove off the side of the road and got the car stuck. Once he realized he was stuck for good, he says he got Polly out of the car and carried her up a steep embankment about 30 yards away.
Get out of the car!
He planned to leave her in the darkness until he could figure out a way to free the car. The rest of Davis's story about what happened at Pythian Road matched the witnesses' accounts. At the time of the incident, the bulletin about Polly's abduction was just going out over police radios. But the deputies were tuned to a different frequency and would not have heard it even if they had been in their cars. They ran his license, but the equipment they had at that time was only able to give a cursory printout of Davis' driving record. It couldn't generate his criminal record. They found nothing they could hold him on.
What I want you to do is, all right, I'm going to follow my finger.
Davis recalled how the deputies pulled his car out and escorted him to the main highway. But he claims that he waited for 15 or 30 minutes and returned to the site to find Polly. Then he just drove around. At some point, he realized he had to get rid of her. At long last, authorities had found out what they'd been desperate to know. Polly Klaas was dead, and Richard Allen Davis was the man responsible. Davis agreed to take them to the site in a deserted area of Cloverdale where he had left the body. It was night, but inspectors felt the need to confirm Davis's story couldn't wait until daybreak. He led them to a field near an abandoned lumber mill. Out in the field, under some boards, investigators found the body of Polly Klaas.
It was an odd feeling. You're in the presence of somebody like Davis, and just a few yards away is what's left of a very beautiful, innocent 12-year-old.
The Polly Klaas case was special because people cared. Because the whole community stepped forward and said, this is the last child you're going to take, and that this is our child, and that we are going to go out and look for her until we find her.
The case wouldn't come to trial until 1996. But after 10 weeks in the courtroom, a jury found Davis guilty on 10 counts, including kidnapping, robbery, burglary, murder, and attempting to commit a lewd act on a child. The latter charge Davis continued to deny during the entire trial. Investigators strongly believed that despite Davis's testimony, Polly was already dead at the time deputies helped him with his car. He was sentenced to death and continues to sit on death row at San Quentin Prison. Polly Klaas left behind a legacy to save other lives. The way missing persons cases are handled has changed forever since the investigation. Law enforcement databases are linked to different agencies providing vital information to multiple jurisdictions. Missing persons bulletins are now sent out over all police channels. At routine pullovers and traffic stops, officers can access not only driving histories but criminal records as well. Implementation of the 3 strikes you're out legislation was a direct result of the case, as was the push to expedite the appeals process in murder cases. And a foundation established in Polly's name aids the search for missing children.
It looked just a little fuzzy on the website.
Involvement of the FBI was critical to bringing resolution to this case. Had they not come in and gotten involved early on, it's doubtful we would ever have had resolution, or certainly that it would have been as quickly as it was, even though it seemed like a long time.
The unique partnership that was formed between local police and the FBI set a precedent that continues to this day.